Afghanistan. Cyril? Thank you. I work for France 24. As you said, we felt that this attack that started a few weeks ago was accelerating. And personally, with my team, it was a strange experience. We were in the air when Kaboul fell. This 2 hours and a half flight on Kaboul on August the 15th had us turning for an hour around the Kaboul airport because the Talibans had entered the city. So we were in the air for an hour waiting for the airport to be open because the Americans were blocking it. Then we had to wait for a bit and wait a few days. And then I landed with my team and a few other journalists, including Liseron, and entered this new Afghanistan, this reshaping Afghanistan. It was still the Islamic Republic because NATO forces, US forces, special forces, diplomatic forces were still controlling the airport to try and prevent this exodus that we followed every day. And then very quickly we decided to leave this last Western controlled sanctuary and to enter through this security corridor managed by the Talibans. We entered the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan controlled by the Talibans. That's the decision we made, and I still remember us going through the heart of Kabul with a Qatar escort, not really knowing what we were getting into. And what was quite surprising to see is that the Taliban forces were quite surprised by the progress they made, as you said. The decision was to try and show a new face, this 2.0 Taliban version that they tried to show to the journalists who were present. But what surprised us was how shocked the population was, devastated to see the Talibans taking power in Kabul 20 years later again. So they were truly shocked, and that was also associated to this massive exodus of families trying to flee the country and trying to access the airport. That was shocking. And the safety conditions were worsened this because there was a terrorist attack a few days later. It was truly a leap into the unknown, and this was a state of shock along with this countdown, because on August the 31st it was the last day of departure of the US after a 20 years war. So the Afghan population was very concerned. It was truly a leap into the unknown, and professionally certain journalists decided to leave to get back to their country, and some of us decided to stay in order to see what Afghanistan and Kabul would become after the departure of the Western soldiers. And after this deadline, this historical deadline, the departure of the US forces in very difficult conditions, because this is a lost war, the Talibans were parading, shooting in the air, and so proud of winning against the greatest army in the world. And the Afghan population starting to understand that those who were eligible to flee the country, those who worked with international organizations or helped the coalition, would be left in the country. That was extremely shocking to me. That's millions of Afghan people. And also the fact that the Kabuli, who have a more modern world, they were at the heart of those 20 years of emancipation, of education of the society, were silenced. They went from shock to helplessness, in a trauma, and the concern of reliving what they went through during 1996 and 2001. And we all went through this. We all saw those huge efforts of communication of the Taliban commanders, and we can see this dichotomy between the decisions of the Taliban commandment and the basic Talibans in Kabul and the rest of the country. Thank you very much for being so precise and concise. I'm now going to give the floor to Liseron Boudoul, so she can tell us how she felt, especially around the population. I'm going to try and not speak for too long.
So we were at the airport in Kabul with a few foreign media, with the BBC, with American channels, and we were very badly received by the American soldiers. And the American soldiers said, "What are you doing here? You're a problem to us." And so they left us on the airfield, on the tarmac for hours and hours. And we managed to convince Qatari forces to get us outside of the airport, where the situation was really bad. We could hear shooting into the air, and we could sense that beyond those walls, beyond those gates into the airport, there were thousands of Afghanis and families. We could see families with babies in their arms and trying to get onto one of the last military planes, because there were only a few days before the last of the American evacuation. So we managed to leave the airport during the night, and we discovered Kabul. We saw a few Talibans, and we were not sure what we could do. And we reached our hotel, and there was we had a choice of, basically we went to the hotel in the city center that was open. The other choice was a hotel protected by the Americans, but we decided not to go there. But we could see that in the hotel we went to, the Talibans were controlling the access into the hotel and from the hotel. And we stayed there for 3 weeks, but the Talibans were already there, so we could talk to them, of course. And of course, it's not so easy, but after a while we were able to talk to the Talibans. We were able to talk to the head of security of the Talibans. We met them at breakfast at the hotel, and they were queuing with a machine gun on the shoulder to get a bit of a porridge or an omelette. So it was very strange, and we were able to go out into the streets of Kabul. I bought an abaya to make sure that I wouldn't be too noticeable, and my cameraman had the kameez, the traditional Afghani shirt and trousers, and we tried to talk and meet some Afghanis, because there were a lot of Afghanis everywhere. And the Talibans let us work. I was surprised, and they let us work. And why did the Talibans let us work? Because they decided to show the international community and the world at that moment, a few days after the takeover of Kabul, that they were open, that they had maybe changed in a certain way. But there were a few Western journalists in Kabul who were able to go onto the streets, meet Afghanis in the streets. And I saw that it was possible. It was possible to ask questions to Talibans on the street, and I would put the microphone in front of their faces, and I'm thinking, I'm a woman, they don't like women, and some of them said, where's your man, where's your husband protecting you, where's your brother, where's your father? And I explained that I'm a journalist, and we tried to negotiate, but mostly the Talibans that I interviewed responded and answered. So I could see that there was a decision or a message passed, maybe from higher up, because the people we meet we meet fighters on the ground, they're not all open, they're very different, but what we can sense And what we can see is that we're able to send a news reportage to my channel every night. But the atmosphere of the mission is that there's a huge fear beyond the astonishment that Cyril has felt. What I felt, maybe because I'm a woman, I sensed a very, very strong fear in the capital. There's not one single Afghani who doesn't say, I'm afraid, I'm terrorized, I don't know what's going to happen. And even the Talibans took Kaboul a lot faster than they thought. They have no idea about how they're going to manage the city. And we can sense that the Talibans are they're curious, and we can see Talibans discovering ice creams and discovering fun fairs or discovering various attractions. And so there's something very strange, sometimes a bit like Disneyland, if you like, but with limits, because very quickly you can see that the Talibans react as soon as there's a car they do not like, or for the first 2 days I was wearing jeans, and I get comments from Taliban straight away and said the Islamic law does not allow you to show your legs. So very quickly we can sense that there are measures that are being implemented from higher up until the Americans leave, or the last American soldier leaves the Afghanistan, and then they want to show us that yes, it's them, and they're going to do whatever they want. Thank you. And so that, and now we'll do whatever we want, arises one question, and now what happens? What is happening in Afghanistan? So through the testimony of someone that I'm not going to introduce, because Shekeba got a standing ovation today. Most of you have heard her this morning. Shekeba, who's the chairwoman of an NGO called Free Afghanistan. And Shekeba, can you explain to us what you know about the situation in Afghanistan today through your NGO, after the astonishment that our journalist mentioned? I just wanted to thank all the young people who are here today, because Afghanistan is a very complicated topic. Maybe you have the feeling you don't understand anything, but no, you will see that what is happening in Afghanistan is something that concerns all of us, because it's there where geopolitical issues are at stake, and it's going to help you for your history and geography lessons, surely. And I also want to remind you of one thing: the Talibans in 1996, from 1996, and the Talibans from 2021 are the same. It's the world that's changed. It's social networks. It's the neighboring countries that gave recognition to this regime. China, Russia, Pakistan have all recognized the regime, but Talibans are the same. And for 20 years in that country, we've realized that we needed to eradicate international terrorism. We promised the Afghani people that we would help them reconstruct that country in exchange for their collaboration to fight those terrorists and the terrorists that attacked the World Trade Center. But it's important to recall that. And today, even though geopoliticians say that history doesn't repeat, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, history has repeated itself. So what's happening? They've come back in 2021, but they are being supported by the neighboring countries. It's all been decided. The international community, the Americans, also Europeans. Europe left Afghanistan in 2014. In 2014, the NATO and the European forces left without any exit strategy. So yes, we can say that the Americans have left and have abandoned Afghanistan, but we did the same. And so we left Afghanistan after saying that there were peace negotiations where the Afghanis were not really present, and everything was taking place in Qatar on the future of that country. and saying that there would be an inclusive government with having everyone in that government. And you saw what happened on the 15th of August. You showed who were the masters of the country in the first few days. They tried to show a more open image, but every day more and more things are forbidden. Yesterday it was the fact that school or working was forbidden for women, but they couldn't wear heels because it makes too much sound. And the only thing that has changed is that the world won't let Afghanis abandoned as they were abandoned in 1996, because we can follow what's going on through social networks, because there are younger women, older women who have lived through the first Taliban regime and who don't want to live the same thing again. When they're on the streets, they are the heroes. We are only the small part of the iceberg. The real heroes are on the streets in Kabul, demonstrating, risking their lives, because that's the reality of Afghanistan. Because some people take the risk to die rather than living under that regime. So yes, it is a revolution somehow. And don't forget that Afghanistan, when the Talibans arrived, the war had been going on for 40 years. When I was born in Afghanistan, war had already started. So that country has been at war for decades and decades and decades. A lot of people have left. Qualified people have left Afghanistan. Some kids. But there were kids who were 4 or 5 when the Talibans were pushed away, who have had some sense of freedom for 20 years. And there are digital. We had programs with Panjshir, with Bamiyan, where with young women who were coding computers and so forth. But you know that these centers have been closed on the 15th of August or before, because the Talibans took provinces around Kabul before getting to Kabul. So what I'm here, and if I want to carry the voice of these people, well, we can live through things through WhatsApp. We can suffer with them on a daily basis, and the Talibans are the same as they were, but the world has changed, and you are all aware of what's happening there. And why is Afghanistan so interesting to us? Not because it's far away. It's because if there's one country that can become the laboratory of fabricating terrorists, it means that today in our cities there will be more terrorist attacks. And I want to say that again. When Massoud came to France in April 2001, there were Talibans in Afghanistan ready, and he said, "Come and help us," so that it doesn't get into your cities. And you saw what happened. That was in April 2001. You know what happened in September 2001, but everything started on the 9th of September 2001, of course. And the suicide bombers don't come from Afghanistan. We fought Russians for 20 years. And no Afghani fought Russians without killing themselves to kill Russians. And the first suicide bombers we had in Afghanistan was on the 9th of September with the death of Commander Massoud, and there were people coming from Europe. And the first thing that they did was to open the prison in Bagram to free suicide bombers from around the world. So yes, to be short, it's the same Talibans. This time they were given the key under the pretext of peace negotiations, but everyone knows, Americans know, Europe knows, and we saw that the Europeans see that there's no international European policy. It's the Americans that decided, and Europe just followed the American decision by not showing their presence and not showing their support. And we didn't try to show these universal values, the right to education, the right to health. These rights should be given to everyone on the planet. And there are institutions like the United Nations that talk about these rights, but in Afghanistan today, the most basic rights are being refused to women and to men. and we cannot close our eyes on this and say we'll leave Afghanis deal with that. No, we know that the West, Europe, the America has the responsibility in what's happening in Afghanistan today. Thank you, Chekeba. Let's try to see what's happening and how can we know what's happening. And you've said it, thanks to social networks, and we can know. But in the valley, in the Panjshir Valley, the social networks have been cut off in other zones as well. Taliban's cut off social networks. So how can we know what's going on there? Can you tell us, Ali, what's happening in that zone in the Panjshir? You know who Ali Messam Nazari is. You started your career as a journalist, I think. Is that right? Yes. And now you are you have a more diplomatic role. You're the leader of and you're in charge of international relations, and you're also the spokesperson of the movement of Ahmed Massoud, the son of Commander Massoud. What's happening in the Panjshir Valley today?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be part of this forum and conference today. The situation, unfortunately, after August 15th, disintegrated in Afghanistan, and basically all the state structures and the armed forces fragmented, and almost all of the political elite, the political class, the political parties, left the country into exile, except one individual who predicted August 15th, 3-4 months before it happened here in France. Commander Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late Ahmad Shah Massoud, came to France on an official visit in March 2021. And with all the French authorities that he met, from President Macron to everyone else in the government, he said the Western world should not abandon Afghanistan. The threat of terrorism is increasing. Unfortunately, the state structure and the armed forces is going to disintegrate. And this was before President Biden announced the full withdrawal, so we were predicting and forecasting what happened. So after August 15th, when the state and the government fragmented, there was one individual in the airport that made an ultimate decision. Everyone else left, and even there was a President Macron called, and he was arranging a jet to come and pick him up. However, Commander Ahmad Massoud said, no, I'm going to go and resist against this tyranny, against this oppressive and terrorist group. I'm not going to abandon my people. So he boarded a helicopter and went to Panjshir Valley. And since then, he has launched the National Resistance Front, which is resisting global terrorism, which is resisting oppression against humanity, oppression against specifically women. And the resistance continues till now. And the main objective and main aims of the resistance is to establish justice in Afghanistan, to preserve democracy, and overall to bring freedom to any citizen who wants freedom inside Afghanistan. So freedom, justice, and women's rights, human rights, democracy, these are the objectives and aims of the National Resistance Front. Unfortunately, because the National Resistance Front was abandoned in this fight, it did face difficulties in the first few weeks, and in September 6th, 2021, an ultimate decision was made that conventional war against the Taliban is impossible. Fighting the Taliban with limited resources is difficult to resist at the current moment. So we withdrew from the main valley of Panjshir to the sub-valleys. Panjshir, half of Panjshir is made up of sub-valleys. There is a main valley running from south to north, and then throughout the valley there's sub-valleys and semi-valleys, and our forces withdrew to the semi-valleys. And since then, they've been continuing the resistance from there. It's mostly an unconventional war now. It's a guerrilla war. However, the resistance is going to continue until we achieve our objectives. Unfortunately, the mass media and what we're hearing today is that there's a civil war going on in Afghanistan, which myself and my compatriots, we believe it is not a civil war. It's not an internal warfare between forces in the north and forces in the south. This is something that's being portrayed by many people in the media, but we disagree with this. Currently, we're fighting a global war against terrorism inside Afghanistan all along. This global war against terrorism started before 2001, as Mrs. Hashimi stated, that the late Commander Massoud started his struggle against international terrorism way before 2001, before the events of September 9th, 2001. However, the world joined us after September 2001 and abandoned us in August 2021. But this war on international terrorism, just how it began before September 2001, it's going to continue. Because right now, unfortunately, there's thousands of foreign fighters in Afghanistan. There's, in the past year, thousands have come into Afghanistan from Iraq and Syria, from North Africa, from South Asia, from Central Asia. Just in the beginning of September, the operation that the Taliban terrorists launched against Panjshir Valley, there was more than 500 Al-Qaeda fighters, mostly Arab speakers, who fought alongside the Taliban. And then you had the Pakistani component also fighting alongside the Taliban. They gave air support for the Taliban. There were drones throughout Panjshir Valley targeting the National Resistance Front. So it is not a civil war, and it's not an internal conflict where it's only going to impact Afghanistan. If the National Resistance Front is abandoned, if this current policy that the West has, which is disengagement and completely ignoring the situation there, just how the West ignored Afghanistan after 1992, it is going to come to Western Europe and North America. Just how after 1992, Afghanistan was ignored, we had September 2001 occur, the same might happen again. There's still opportunities to prevent the worst from happening, especially by assisting and supporting the last remaining democratic forces, the last remaining Western allies inside Afghanistan, which is the National Resistance Front. If the last remaining allies that the Western world has, that the free world has, terrorism will come back to Western Europe and North America, 1. 2, if the last democratic forces are defeated without the West coming to its support and helping this resistance survive, it will be detrimental to the whole concept of democracy, the whole concept of having a free world. Because right now, the Taliban, with their allies, whether it's China or Pakistan or the others, they're representing autocracy, oppression, a closed society. They're against freedom, they're against rights, they're against democracy, and all these values that we all cherish. And if they win, if they're victorious at the end, and the West abandons democratic forces, then other democratic forces in the region, whether it's in North Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, they will be demoralized, and unfortunately, they will lose their battles. Because right now, what is happening in the Sahel is pretty much related to what's happening in Afghanistan or in the Middle East. So it's very important for us to keep Afghanistan in mind, for all forces, political forces in Western Europe and in North America to stay engaged. We are not asking for ground forces, but support and assistance for the National Resistance Front will guarantee our survival and will guarantee the security of the free world and guarantee the preservation of democracy everywhere else. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you for that situation, for that, and then for the reality of what you're saying. And you said, Shekeba, what happens, what is happening in Afghanistan concerns all of us, and we must hope that it won't concern us the way it did in 2001. So we've had this presentation of the situation, if you like, of the events, but at the heart of our conversation are the Talibans. We heard that Talibans had changed, that they were now more moderate, that one could talk to them. But the question is, have they really changed? How did they behave during the negotiations in Doha that lasted for more than a year? Did they respect their word? What word did they give? And I want to give the floor first to Fozia Koufi and to Michael Barry. Fozia, you know her, she's a fighter for women's rights forever. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Peace. She was a member of Parliament from 2005 and between 2005 and 2019. And it's difficult in France to be a woman in Parliament, but you can imagine in Afghanistan. And she took part in the negotiations in NOAA, in the government delegation. Fozia, what is your feeling about the Taliban? You took part in the negotiations with them, and what is your vision of the Taliban in Kabul today? So you have maybe 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to see a lot of people, young people especially. In some occasions, it's heartbreaking, and I feel bad because, you know, I actually attended such gatherings where thousands of people, students, boys and girls, came together to listen to what we wanted to say in Afghanistan, something probably that is not possible anymore. So in a way, I get emotional when I see all these hopeful, energetic faces here, but when I look at the situation back home, I see a young, talented, but yet disappointed and a hopeless group of people. So thank you for your interest also on the situation in Afghanistan. I must say that the reason I actually got engaged with the Taliban in the negotiation, which was not something easy. It's always easy to talk to you because we share the same things. But it is not easy with some people who to engage non-violently with a group which only believe in violence. It's not easy. For me, it was a different level of women's power and women's rights because I was basically representing my country with people that only, 20 years back, and even now, they don't regard women as a first-class citizens. They will regard women as even second class and nobody, basically. Now we were in this situation that I was representing, I had the privilege to represent my people, equal rights holders. So I really wanted to get engaged because I wanted to tell them that Afghanistan today is different and that women of Afghanistan are an unavoidable part of the society. They cannot be avoided, they cannot be bypassed. And the new generation, this is a generation that is empowered, and you now see people who are fighting under extreme different security challenges, opening up their chest to the Taliban bullets in the streets of Kabul is an indication of a transformed generation. I wanted to pass this message to them. I wanted to invite them to coexistence. I wanted to invite them to tolerance because the religion that I represent, Islam, is about tolerance. It's about coexistence. It's about peace. It is not the religion that they represent. They actually, unfortunately, misinterpret my religion. They misrepresent my religion. Their definition of Islam is a very extreme way of, even in many ways, mixed with culture and tradition. I wanted to tell them that it's okay to have a difference of views, but we need to exist with it and accept our differences of views. And that's why I was the first to get engaged in these negotiations. Although back home in Afghanistan, a lot of civil society organizations and women actually were critical of my engagement because they thought that we should not engage at all with Taliban, while I believe in a different way. I always believe that communication and engagement and passing your message is always important, because I have, like my son, Ali, and myself, and my daughters who are sitting here, and a lot of Afghans I see recently being evacuated, sitting here, I can see them. We are a generation of war. We are born in war, grew up in war, and some of us die in war. Only those who actually go through that situation will understand the pain of being living in war. Not everybody will understand that. So I wanted to make them understand that we are fed up of war. We want to live in peace and harmony, and let's work together on that. That's why I participated in these negotiations. However, when the Americans actually signed a deal with Taliban on the 29th of February 2020, and only Taliban were the party to the negotiation, there was nobody from the Republic side, that already emboldened Taliban. Because when I met them in 2019, they were talking about things that it's okay for women from their perspective of, or their version of Islam, it's okay for women to be minister, up to prime minister, it's okay for women to go to school and universities and be engaged in business. There is no problem, women can be judges. And we were all very optimistic because we were talking to a completely different view of Taliban. However, when they signed the agreement with the United States, and I they talked to them officially on September last year, I realized that they are not the same Taliban that they were before they signed a deal with the Americans. They were more extreme. They were more hardliners. They were not genuinely putting their efforts into peace negotiations. So that means they were trying to look moderate and nice before they signed a deal with American, just to let the world know that they are a trustable partner, so that the world will sign an agreement with them. And after they had the agreement, they were completely people that they were initially, the same views, the same practices. But still, we were trying. Along my other sisters in the negotiation, and also brothers that were with us, the men, we were trying to make them understand that only it's with talking with each other that we can have a common path for political participation. We were there in Doha for 1 year. They were even much slower when there was a US election, because they wanted to wait and see what the result of US election and when there was a new administration, and the new administration announced the withdrawal of their troops by September, I saw completely there was no interest anymore from Taliban side on negotiation. They were basically favoring their military strategy, not a peace strategy. So I knew that things will go wrong, but to see in front of my eyes, as somebody who spent all my life in Afghanistan, not only we invest our time and energy, but I invested my blood in that country. To see everything collapse in front of my eyes and everything back to scratch because of the mistakes of international community. Yes, we had a government that was corrupt. We had a government that was power-centric. But also there were many international factors that resulted to where we are now. And now we have to start from scratch. It's painful for me to talk to you about the problems. I wanted to talk to you about the successes. I wanted to talk to you about how proud nation we are. We are a proud nation, but oppressed. And therefore, we would like to plead to you to stand in solidarity. Because if you think that whatever goes on in Afghanistan will not affect you, it's not true. We are living in a world which is so interconnected. Our paths are together. We have to stand in solidarity with each other. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Fozia.
Thank you very much, Fozia, for this very strong testimony. I'm now going to ask the same question to Michael Barry. Michael Barry is a professor, writer, and expert on Central Asia and Afghan issues. I'm just going to mention a few of his publications: The Kingdom of Insolence, Massoud from Islam to Freedom, and the Le Cri Afghan, which is to be published soon. So Michael, did the Talibans change? Yes, of course the Talibans have not changed. And the complexity of the question demands an answer that is broken down in different parts, if you will let me explore those different parts. First, I would like to say something obvious, which is crucial. What's at stake here is a universal conception of human rights, yes or no. Everything around this, political, strategic, economic, is secondary. But first, this crucial question. The international community, after the horrors of World War II, has adopted a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1948. 1948, Afghanistan signed this Universal Declaration. This Universal Declaration insists on gender equality, prohibiting torture, and prohibiting slavery. So we really need to put things in a legal context, if you will. However, the new Taliban government openly declared that democracy is not acceptable for Afghanistan, that the Universal Human Rights Declaration from 1948 has no legitimacy, and that the only legitimacy comes from Sharia, which, dictated by God through its human spokespersons, is relevant anytime, everywhere, for all peoples, all ethnies, and all cultures. This Sharia prohibits the idea of having human groups through democratic elections to change the legislation. So democracy, in the sense of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, political parties and elections are considered null. From then, you can interpret certain positions through negotiations, as Mrs. Fawzia Koofi reminded us. Of course, at first, some might want to show a moderate aspect, and then later have a stricter aspect because they might get a political or military victory. But we need to remind us of what's crucial. Human rights are not negotiable and cannot be compromised on. Women's rights to education, to work, to taking part in the political life, and to the highest levels of responsibility is not something you can expect as a compromise, as a concession. It's an uncompromisable right. And we need to insist on this because we are talking about a regime that has dictated an emirate. That means absolute monarchy. Is the emirate of a monarchy advised by advisors, experts in Quran legislation, and this cannot be questioned by any opposition as long as the emirate gets its legitimacy from a very strict implementation of Sharia. Ali doesn't want to talk about civil war. I will talk later about this concept of civil war, but it is true that since the first royal constitution in 1923 up until the Northern Africa or Gulf countries, this sort of tension that has existed since the start of the 20th century between constitutionalists who want to set up a legislation based on the legitimacy of the elections, a constitutional monarchy, for instance, and the partisans of the strict implementation of Sharia as a godly law. Well, these concepts go through the Islamic world and has found one of its most bloody battlefields in Afghanistan, which opposes Afghans to other Afghans, but not only, I agree. Let me conclude this first part by saying one can look into political games, some very fine analysis of the local reality, but you should never forget that these are fundamental human rights that are being violated. And let me remind you that up until 1992, no human being who respects human rights or women's rights could accept apartheid in South Africa. That was absolutely unacceptable. In chancelleries, some might have said that South Africa was an essential ally against the Soviet influence on the African continent. Some might have said that South Africa was important around its mining activities, but for most of the global public opinion, apartheid was doomed. And I don't want to pretend I'm an expert, but the seriousness of the stakes here go beyond expertise. This is a fundamental right. And if Afghan women's rights are denied, then the rights of humanity are denied. The entire humanity, not only Afghan women, all women, therefore all human beings. After this being said, I can play the expert, the regional specialist, and present an analysis. So let's do it, if you will. I will try to sum up the most important aspects, in my opinion. First, Pakistan is a state that never forgave Afghanistan in 1947 for voting against their admission in the UN and for aligning with USSR of the time and with India, requesting from Pakistan to give certain territories annexed by the English, to give them to Afghanistan. So that is a geopolitical gap. And before this perception of Pakistan as an alliance between India, Soviet Russia, and Afghanistan, Pakistan allied with the US by offering their territory as a corridor from Central Asia around the Soviet and Chinese territories up until the start of the Gulf. So for the US commitment, the Pakistan alliance was crucial, and in this disagreement between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the US thought the Pakistan party was strategically more important. These are the roots of this tragedy. The more Afghanistan was absorbed by the Soviet influence, the more Pakistan could use its central argument to Washington. If we want to prevent Kabul from controlling its own territory, as they're more and more pro-Soviets, if we want to make sure that the Soviet influence has a setback in Afghanistan, then we must help the most Sunnite and integrist forces in Afghanistan, not only to push back the Soviet influence, but also to push back the Iranian influence. And throughout the 90s, the Americans accepted this Pakistan offer to manage and support the Afghan resistance, which Pakistanis always tried to push towards Sunnite extremists, therefore being against the Iranians and against the Marxists and Leninists. However, another crucial stakeholder was China. And I will refer to my opinion on the situation as an American. China fought India in 1962. And immediately after, China and Pakistan became allies. Pakistan opened its geographical corridor, helping China to access the start of the Gulf. As part of this wall of Soviet power going from Mongolia to USSR to India in the 70s, 80s, Pakistan opened this amazing road to China in order to reach the western part of the continent. Regardless of human rights violations or Islamists' extremes of the Pakistan regime, there was a fundamental agreement between Beijing and Islamabad. Islamabad never supported the demonstrations, and Pakistan extended its influence over Afghanistan, and therefore China saw its influence increasing in the western half of the continent. These are the main strategic stakes here. And the Talibans, who were trying to get power just for power, made some compromise for a while, then got a stricter line, which clearly made an appeal to China to industrialize the country, to develop mining explorations, and to have an electronic surveillance of dissidents in the country. The virtual protectorate from China over Pakistan, or the American influence by their disengagement, is leaving the Pakistan space in the area of China. And added to this is the Taliban Afghanistan strengthening the Chinese influence. And I speak as an American. I am absolutely shocked by the incapacity of my president to try and pivot over China by taking China as a beach along the Pacific facing California. But China is a great power in Central Asia. China has huge weight over the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Already in the current setup, and is now moving over the great Chinese influence area. Very quickly, Michael, please. I'll try to conclude. The terrible question will be, what do we do for the Afghan population who might even die of hunger? Let me remind you that totalitarian powers since the start of the 20th century played this extremely smart double role and double game to rival their authority through those massacres, through this fear, by trying to stifle resistance powers, by relying on democratic powers, saying, our country, our people are dying from hunger. How can you decline to help them? But when you give aid to a population, the Soviet in the 20s or the Afghan population today, then you will have to go through the Taliban regime, who will be funded for what matters, that is electronic and weaponry by China and by Pakistan. So you can see here that the dilemma and the stakes are terrible. Thank you very much, Michael Barry, for this remarkable geopolitical lesson, which indeed helps us center the issue. And as you can see, the issue is not only impacting the Afghans, as some of the previous speakers said. Let's try to sum up a little bit. I would like to cover another topic, and some of you already referred to it, the concept of resistance. Clearly today, we can see that the future of Afghanistan and of the area and our own future can only come from the resistance of the Afghan people itself. The question is the following: can the Talibans stay at power? Yes or no? It's going to be complicated. They don't agree on everything. They are having issues. And in that case, where can true resistance come from? Will it come from the Afghan people? And if yes, how can we help them? I'm now going to give the floor to each of you, 5 minutes each. And then, or maybe simultaneously, another question. Can resistance defeat the Talibans? And if so, how can we help them? So we'll have a total of 10 minutes, 3 minutes each. Let's start in alphabetical order. Michael, you started, you can conclude, and I'm going to give the floor to Lise Romboudou to answer this question. Resistance, women, the young generation, and how can we help? I'm going to tell you about what I saw, what I felt from the field. I'm not going to give a geopolitical analysis. In Kabul, because I only went out of Kabul once during 3 weeks, but in Kabul, I didn't really feel a true resistance will in Kabul, except for a few women. Most men, most Afghan men I met on the street told me that they wanted to leave the country at any cost. And many are not really thinking about how to resist yet. It might come later. So this concept of resistance is an issue I mainly talked about with women who I met in hiding, because I saw very little women on the streets when I was there, and most of them were wearing a burqa, this famous Afghan blue burqa, where you can barely see the eyes, and they didn't dare to talk to me on the streets because behind them were Talibans. Although they were not next to me, they were always close, and I could already feel in them this concern. If I speak, there might be some retaliation. So I met women to hear their testimony by hiding myself as well, by hiding the camera, and going to some surrounding neighborhoods, not in the center of Kabul, to avoid being followed. I met a university professor and a lawyer who were hiding at home, who had failed in trying to reach the airport and therefore could not catch one of the last military planes, and who are still trying to, although I have a lot of doubt around the possibility for these women to leave the country. They told me that they needed to resist, and they gave me a very specific example. They denied having their face blurred in their interview because they wanted to show the world this face that the Talibans are trying to hide. I think this was a very strong message, but they also asked me to spread this message. Don't give up on us. Don't give up on us and try to come and save us, because they don't know how to resist this new power, which doesn't seem to show many signs of openness. That is that firm line that we're seeing at the moment. This doesn't mean that we should stop pressuring the Talibans. I think the biggest mistake would be trying to activate a solely military resistance and forgetting that communication channels must be used, and we shouldn't stop the communication channels. And with Fauzia, we already starting working on a project in this sense, and I think we should maintain this pressure. Thank you very much, Liseron. I will go in alphabetical order, Shikeva. I would like to remind you of something. I'm not going to give a history lesson like Michael Barry. He's much better than me at this. On the one hand, resistance, a people who has been in resistance 4 or 5 times over 40 years against the Russians, the Civil War, then the Talibans again, then a corrupted regime, then the Talibans again coming back. A country that is being emptied, more than 20 million people living in extreme poverty, no food to feed their children, for mothers. A pack of wheat is 25 euros today when the average salary is $48 or $68. Resistance when you're marching in Kaboul and you end up killed in another area and your family cannot see the body or take pictures. A photographer who was murdered 3 days ago because he took pictures of women marching. Kamikazes every day, non-stop for 20 years. Kaboul doesn't look like Kaboul. Since 5 years ago, there are bunkers everywhere to protect yourself against kamikazes. In France, we had Charlie and the Bataclan. We are going through the trial right now. We are the 5th power in the world, and we are still appalled today. I have friends who were in Le Bataclan and still didn't recover from what happened during Charlie or Le Bataclan. And now, quietly, here, comfortable, I'm asking to resist and to fight and to stand up. So you need to compare this concept of resistance to the reality of the country. And let me repeat, we're not the heroes. The heroes are the ones who stand up, the women who continue to live in Afghanistan. Just by living, they're resisting. They're still there. They're still saying that they want to work to feed their family. But when we talk about resistance, when we talk about standing up and fighting, you have to compare with the reality of that country, and you'll understand that each gesture is a hero gesture from those 38 million people. Just getting up and believing in tomorrow is already a hero move. It's already resistance. Asking journalists, help us, support us, is resisting. Asking a Paris NGO to help us to start e-learning, online training, asking for online training is resisting. This is what the Afghan population goes through today. So before we talk about resistance based on our principle, comfortably seated here in Normandy for Peace with the nice lunch we had today, let's put things in their place. We're talking about a people that has suffered for more than 45 years, and resisting is what Afghan women are doing every day. And every day I feel very small when I look at these women who show me live on WhatsApp their march in Kaboul, when they show me a man with a machine gun next to them, and when they stay on the line and tell me I'd rather die and be killed by this one than going through what I went through before. Again, that's resisting.
Tout en ajoutant.
While adding that what I felt is that the priority for Afghani women and men is how can we eat tomorrow? And they will need our help and our humanitarian aid very quickly. Otherwise, it will be a humanitarian catastrophe and disaster in this country very quickly. Yes, it's central and I hope we can have a look. We can talk about this in education. So how can we help Afghani women, especially to resist? What can we do for Afghani women and men who are resisting?
Well, we know that the Taliban are a group of fighters, so they will unite very quickly when they see that there is a military fight against them. And that's why Panjshir was defeated, because they actually attacked Panjshir from every angle. They yet don't know, they're very confused about the fact that people in the streets of Kabul and other provinces stand against them and resist. I think this will expand, despite the fact that there is poverty, that people have lost jobs, that especially women who were the breadwinners of their family, they lost jobs, there is no job, they are not in the government, and there is a claim of $50 per month is for those who work, and majority of the population do not work actually. Majority of the population do not work. Only speaking about this is easy. To be in that situation is a different environment. So I think the resistance will continue. And I think that resistance will weaken Taliban, because they don't know how to handle a population which is so empowered. And women have been in the full front of that resistance. I think it will expand. I think few things need to be done when it comes to supporting people of Afghanistan. First of all, there is a need for a meaningfully inclusive government in Afghanistan, with inclusion of ethnic groups, religious minorities, and women. The country is a country of minorities, and it will not survive if everybody do not see themselves. It's not going to last. The government will not be sustainable. This is the first thing. The second thing, Taliban must meaningfully respect the rights of an empowered nation. This is a nation that is not 1996 or 2001. This is a nation that already is empowered, and we have some of them, young generation here. And when I see my people from my party, from other groups, from other social groups, including some men also, stand in the full front along with women, majority women, of course, but some men also, at that difficult circumstances to protect their rights, I think that is an empowered generation. We have to really support them. Taliban must meaningfully commit themselves to respecting the rights. And last but not least, Taliban have inspired a lot of military extremist groups by their so-called victory. A lot of jihadi groups, not only in the region, far region, and also across the world, will now do the same things that the Taliban did. They will probably use Afghanistan once again. A military resistance is, of course, when people have no other option, and a lot of people have no option in Afghanistan but to militarily resist Taliban. We have our own fight. Our fight is civic resistance. We will continue, and I hope the world will watch the deeds of Taliban in terms of their disassociation with other military extremist groups, because that is the main fear. Now, you mentioned, Emmanuel, about other military extremist groups. My fear is that those who actually were fighting with Taliban in Afghanistan or against Taliban, like ISIS and others, will now become allies, because they inspired all other military extremist groups. And therefore, I think all of these conditions are met. Then we can talk about, future steps. We need to stay engaged, you're right, to make sure that these conditions are met. If not, I think we are putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation as an international community, as a global citizen, by giving Taliban blank checks. They have a lot of hopes towards Europe and US. When I was getting out of my home, I was in Kabul for 3 weeks because I didn't want to leave Afghanistan. This is a country that has given me so much love and respect. I wanted to return the respect and love, but I was literally out under house arrest. I didn't want to leave. So when I wanted to leave, and I was in the negotiation with Taliban to let me go to the airport, not in a military flight, but a regular flight, they say, we will let you go, but don't go to Europe. Because they were afraid that our message will get across Europe and they will lose the blank checks. So my plea would be, we need to make sure the Taliban actually commit to all international principles, and then we talk about further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Je vais maintenant passer.
I'll now give the floor to our other speaker who's on a video link. How can we help? How can we help Afghanis resist? And then I'll give the floor to Ali. I think talking about resistance today in the situation that we're in, I think it's difficult to talk about resistance. I'm not an expert. I was there at that historical moment, but the only resistance for Afghanis today is survival. And I agree with what people have said before. What can we ask them to resist again? I mean, how could they resist? And I'm not a researcher, and I'm not an expert on the geopolitics of the area, but we saw how abandoned the Afghanis were, and how violent this abandonment from, and the violence of this withdrawal from the West after so many promises. Yeah. And you see how many countries have recognized the Taliban, the Taliban government, China, Pakistan, Qatar, who's playing a very strange role. Qataris were certainly pulling the strings, and Afghanis were the silent witnesses of what was happening. I could talk about Turkey. I could talk about other countries that have helped Talibans. Only 3 countries recognized the Taliban regime in 1996. And so, yes, the world is more global. The paradigm has changed, and in the middle of that, there are Afghanis. I'm thinking of these people, the people that I saw, that and we saw the people who went to the airport but couldn't get onto planes, and it was very tragic to see thousands of families around the airport trying their luck, even though we knew before the departure of the Americans, before the 31st of August, people knew that it would be impossible to get through onto the airport. The Americans were shutting off the inside of the airport, and the Talibans were stopping people from the outside. So there were very distressful scenes, but people wanted to survive, wanted to leave at all costs. So that was humanly absolutely terrible. There were women, men, whole families, some of them killed in a terrorist attack. But I remember personally a face or faces, Hamid and Qayyum, who were my teammates, my Afghani teammates with their families who work with foreigners, like so many people who are left behind. And as soon as I arrived, they said, we worked with French people, we want to leave. Can you find us a plane? We have no future in this country. We are from Kaboul, we are the elite, we speak a foreign language, and we want to leave. And Hamid said, I have 2 young children. There's no future for my children in an Afghanistan that has been abandoned so violently, an Afghanistan that is in the hands of the Talibans. So talking about resistance today is a world that doesn't have the same meaning, if you like, in a country like this, in a country that has been so violently abandoned. So yes, we can't really talk about resistance, and I feel ashamed as a Westerner, and I will continue to fight to try and get the members of my Afghani teammates out of the country. So the same question to Ali. In spite of everything that's been said, living on a daily basis in extremely difficult circumstances, dangerous circumstances, I went to Algeria many times in the black years, in the dark years, between 92 and 98 in Algeria. And my Algerian friend said, I'd rather die standing rather than live kneeling down. And taking your children to school was risking your life. And it's an example that I remember It was a moral resistance in Algeria at the time, but women managed to survive and to resist. So what can we do today, Ali, not to abandon you again?
Thank you very much. There's one thing that I want to point out first, is that poverty is not something new in Afghanistan. That hunger or poverty is going to prevent resistance from happening in our country. People who know our history, like Professor Berry there, know that our situation was much worse in the 1980s. Most people did not have anything to eat in the 1980s or 1990s, but we resisted. Because for us, it's not survival what matters, it's our freedom, it's justice what matters for us. We've been fighting for our freedom and for our justice for the past 50 years without having anything to eat. Hunger isn't something new in our country. Poverty isn't something new in our country. Most people who resisted, both in the 80s against Soviet aggression, in the 1990s against international terrorism, specifically Taliban terrorists, they didn't have anything to eat. They didn't have wealth. They didn't have much to do in the country. But what mattered was freedom. They wanted their freedom. They wanted justice in their country. I have to point out the reason why I'm here in France, or why the leader of the National Resistance Front came to France in March 2021, and why exactly 20 years ago our great leader, the late Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, came to France. Because we believe France is an example of resistance for us. France faced the same situation as Afghanistan more than 70 years ago. A worse situation. You had a strong, sophisticated army come into this country, take over the country, take over the liberation, freedom that existed in France, but the people resisted. General de Gaulle mobilized the people, and they resisted until they took their freedom and established justice once again in this country and established their democracy once again. This is the same thing that's happening in Afghanistan. General de Gaulle was an example for the late Commander Massoud, is an example for Commander Ahmad Massoud, the current leader of the National Resistance. And it is going to be, we are going to follow the footsteps of this country because we believe that France, like before, can lead the West. The West has made a great mistake by abandoning Afghanistan, especially the United States, this current administration in the United States. Made a mistake by abandoning Afghanistan, by withdrawing it, without taking all these repercussions into consideration. But France has always been the country that has had a proactive role in bringing awareness amongst the rest of the Western world that it has made a mistake and has led the Western world into the righteous path. And we believe France, once again, has that role. It can play a constructive role in directing Western policy in the short term to support the resistance inside Afghanistan, to support the democratic forces, to support the women and men. Because one thing it is, the people in Afghanistan are not demoralized. They haven't given up. They haven't succumbed. This isn't the first time that they're feeling pressure. They felt much worse before in their history. And this is a changed generation. The vast majority in Afghanistan, more than around 60–65% of Afghanistan's population are young. They're below the age of 40. Most of these people grew up in the past 20 years where they enjoyed all their freedoms and rights. And they're not going to give up on freedom. They're going to resist, even if it means that they're going to lose their lives. Because once you taste freedom, there's no way of going back. And one thing that I could assure everyone is the National Resistance Front, since I am here representing it, we're going to continue our resistance with the limited resources that we have, even if it means we don't have the world besides us and helping us, supporting us. We're going to continue resistance until every citizen, regardless of race, religion, and gender, who wants freedom, enjoys freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mike, Michael, in 3 words, after all that's been said, can we, the French, your French American, as citizens, how can we support and help Afghanis to how can we help them fight and resist and beat the Talibans? We need to keep the base, the foundation intact, and that is is defending the fundamental rights of human beings. All the women who are members of parliament, ministers, must make sure that their governments do not slip into compromise. We need that foundation. Secondly, some need to feed a population that might die of hunger. The United Nations can do that. And thirdly, we need that crucial support some need to also, so we need to support people through food and supplies, but also through military means. We must never give up. We need to be patient. We need to be tenacious, because if we give up what we are ourselves. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conclusion to that first roundtable. I think there are a lot of young people in the room. I don't know if you can see them, Michael, but there's a lot of young people, and I think the message has been heard. There are several members of parliament in the room, and I'm sorry for not saluting them, but I think the message has been passed on to them. So now we don't really see how many people there are. If maybe we could take questions from the audience. I think the president of the Normandy region, Hervé Morin, is here, and I'm sure that he's heard your message. But before I give the floor to the audience, before I give the mic to the audience, I want to say that there is a risk in fighting in a military way, because there is a military option, but Pakistan will help the Talibans again. So I think we need to resist, but maybe in a different way, with a 2.0 resistance. And we need to be careful in terms of time. Winter is coming. There's less and less petrol. The equipment that the Americans have left will not be maintained. There's no more pilots. So we need to be able to be aware that there might be some degradation from the inside. The Talibans are not unified. The Haqqani network, which is the puppet of the Pakistani intelligence service, the Talibans that you talk to in Doha, Fauzia, might have heard another narrative, and there is and then this Qatar. Joseph Borrell a few hours ago, Altani and Borrell both said that they were disappointed. So disillusioned because of the fact that Talibans were not listening to the advice that they were given. So I do believe that, yes, we can put pressure on other countries, Qatar, for instance. Emmanuel Macron will be receiving the President Rahman, who is maybe the President of Tajikistan, who's maybe the President who's the hardest against the Talibans. So we need to try to put pressure from the outside. There might be an implosion inside, and we need to support all those fighting and outside stakeholders. Afghanistan is part of a region, and we need to put pressure on these heads of states around Afghanistan. So questions for the audience. There's a lot of you today. So if you want, you can ask a question. So if you want to speak, I'll stand up to see, and I can see some hands raised. So if we can bring a microphone to whoever's raising their hand.
que je... Ah.
There's one hand raised in the back.
Allez-y.
Allez-y, monsieur, en vous présentant et en étant, si vous...
Go ahead, sir. Can you please introduce yourself and be concise? Carla Variken, I am director of publication of a magazine called Nouvelle Solidarité, and I work with the Schiller Institute. I think this narrative is one of a unique way of thinking. We're the good ones and the others are the bad guys. If you look at the perspective from Russia, Iran, China, or Pakistan, those countries say, just like General de Gaulle used to say, we have interests. We don't work with regimes, we work with states. So it's in the interest of Russia, China, and also France to stabilize the situation there so that Afghanistan can be part of mutual development. We know that there's a lot of wealth there, lithium, Kara, who can be very useful to our energy transition here. So if there is no help to rebuild Afghanistan, of course, we must set red lines. You don't have to recognize the science of Talibans. However, we're talking about Afghanistan, which must be developed. And I'm asking this question to the keynote speakers. I would like to remind you of the call from Doctors Without Borders asking to develop, unblock the $9 billion blocked on the Federal Reserve, which belong to the Central Bank of Afghanistan, therefore belong to Afghanistan, and can be used for humanitarian aid, for medicine. The World Bank please let me finish. You're being a fundamentalist here. The World Bank has suspended 350 millions. 80% of medications don't reach Afghanistan. People are dying from hunger, from disease, and all you're doing is talk about human rights when people are dying due to your positions. We've heard your opinion, and I think we're going to get an answer which doesn't justify your anger.
I don't think it was a question, it was a statement. Is it realistic to expect from a terrorist group, from a crime syndicate and a drug cartel to develop a country? The Taliban is not a normal political military insurgency. It's a group deeply connected with international terrorism. Right now, Al-Qaeda is fighting besides them, with fighters from North Africa, from the Middle East, and elsewhere. It's a drug cartel. Right now, the Taliban themselves, their leadership, and this is something that the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States reports, that their leadership is directly involved in the production of heroin and meth. They're going to develop a country? Just look at their government today, the so-called government that they announced. No experts, no technocrats, no bureaucrats. All of them uneducated clerics. They're not even educated clerics. Uneducated clerics that only spend 2 to 3 years in a madrasa, and basically those madrasas, we know how they are. And now they're running the public health industry, education, higher education. The dean of Kaboul University a few days ago, our compatriot here, Mrs. Kufi, and the dean of the Kaboul University, and all of our compatriots here have heard him speaking. Instead of focusing on higher education, he's focusing on how women should dress, on how education doesn't matter. The head of Kaboul University, the largest university of Kabul, says higher education doesn't matter, that we should think about God and religion before higher education. That was his speech to students at Kaboul University. They're going to develop a country? I don't know, maybe some people think that's how it works, but we don't think that. The Taliban cannot form a government, it cannot form a bureaucracy, it cannot form an administration to run a state. It does not represent the Afghan state or the Afghan nation. The people who, it doesn't matter about geography, and this is my last point before we go to the next question. What matters in Afghanistan is legitimacy, not geography. The communist regime in Afghanistan for 10 years had most of the country under their control. Ashraf Ghani's government last year had most of the country under their control. And the Taliban today. But one thing that they lack is legitimacy amongst the population. They don't have the hearts and minds of the population. Let me give you an example. For the past 2 decades, the Taliban every year, numerous times in 1 year, would record messages, audio recordings, and written statements calling the people to rise up against the administration of Kaboul, which they called the government of Afghanistan, and foreign forces. But no one answered their calls, because no one supported them. 4 weeks ago, our leader, the leader of the National Resistance Front, Commander Ahmad Massoud, when Main Valley and Panjshir fell, he recorded a statement calling the people to rise up against the Taliban. He called for a general uprising against Taliban terrorists. Within hours, we had women and men flood the streets of Kabul, flood the streets of Mazar, Herat, and every other city in Afghanistan. And since then, we've had continuous demonstrations and protests in support of the resistance and against the Taliban. This shows who has the hearts and minds of the people and who represents the Afghan state and the Afghan nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for this very powerful, insightful response. J'avais vu une main se lever. Alors, attendez, madame. Alors, il y a une question là.
There was one hand as well, a question. Ladies and gentlemen, not a question, but rather a comment as a citizen. Please ask questions. If you're very brief, we'll hear your comment. I was born after World War II from parents and grandparents who went through 2 world wars. I always heard, and this is the Peace Forum, right? I always heard, never again. And if we're here today, it's also to defend our compatriots. And before everyone, I am seeing a man who I must respect. And if he's in trouble, then I must help them regardless of their nationality or the color of their skin. So as a citizen, I'm wondering, what can I do from a human perspective? Having a good behavior with others before I help a country that is having issue, when in my country I can act to avoid violence. You can stop here, then you can have a discussion with the speakers because you're outside of the topic here, off topic. So let me be very brief. We have many hands raised. We cannot hear all the questions, so we'll go in order. I think one woman was standing earlier. Where is she? Madam, and the gentleman over there, and then we'll conclude. Hello, my name is Ina. I'm in high school. I'd like to ask you a question because I was here during the conference this morning, and many times we heard that you were happy to see the youth here present. I agree, but we didn't get any information about this. How can we act? Yes, we're here today, we're listening. I heard Mrs. Hashemi, correct? And I was very touched when you talked about the 38 million people suffering in that country who had to suffer from the Taliban regime. But how can we do as young high school students, as people who study for 8 or 10 hours per day, how can we act to try and have an impact on this conflict? Great, I think Shekeba can answer, and then we'll conclude. A request for the floor? Let me answer to this young girl. You, the young generation, this was said by several people, you need to act every day. There are many organizations, Shekeba's organization and others, who work in Afghanistan. The gentleman said it. He might have gone a bit far with regards to the IMF, but it goes in that sense. We have organizations who work every day on their own capitals in Afghanistan, not going through Taliban fundings, not through international fundings. Shekeba's organization is a free organization. So get into those organizations, go to demonstrations, go to exhibitions. We have artists here, Afghan artists who reside here, so help them, support them, organize exhibitions, symposiums, etc. That's how I believe you can help them here in France. And write letters to your MPs, to your local elected members, representatives, to make sure that France never recognizes this barbarian regime and that no European country does. It's very important because there's a great offensive from the Talibans to be recognized in the UN, and from what I heard, it's not impossible from a legal perspective for this to happen, and this cannot happen. We must remain cautious and reach out to your MPs or any person with power. So you can do this every day through organizations. And if I may add,
Je ne sais pas où vous êtes, mademoiselle, je ne vous vois pas très bien.
I'm not sure where you are, I cannot see you, but I met many students there. Students just like you who were hopeless, incredibly hopeless, and who are waiting to get in contact with young people like you. So you look very much committed. So create a team with your friends, with your teachers, and try to reach out to them. There are still social networks. I could help you out. I could give you a few contacts. And I'm sure just with that, it will help them because they will feel less lonely. That's where resistance starts. And that's what the club does, actually. One moment, the gentleman. Please try to be concise. Emmanuel, François, 2 minutes. Excuse me, may I introduce myself if you don't mind? Thank you. Let me introduce myself, Nasser Nazeri, chair of the Afghanistan Normandy organization. I want to thank the Regional Council for their invitation and for organizing this Forum for Peace. And thanks to them, we're here and we can talk about Afghanistan. But most importantly, before I ask the question, if you allow, I would like to say something important to me. Earlier at the start, you talked about the friendship between France and Afghanistan, which is going to celebrate 1 century anniversary soon. But you didn't say that in 1928, in Afghanistan, there was a proposal to separate religion and the state. That was very important, and it was inspired by the Lumière philosophy in France. And the obscurantism, which came late, had reasons. Why? When the Mujahideen were in Pakistan, these projects were not progressist. The Mujahideen did not respect human rights either. So in Afghanistan, we need a nation state. We're seeing issues there, but in order to resist, you need a state nation. So I would like to know if, as part of this project, some things are being done. That's my question.
Comme ça, chacun va pouvoir répondre.
Let's go around the table.
Vous commencez.
Pas très bien compris la question.
I didn't really understand the question.
Salam alaikum, سأولتنا نفهمی دامج. J'ai pas compris.
Vous n'avez pas compris la question.
Donc je suis passée dans l'autre langue.
Par rapport à la...
I didn't understand the question.
Il faut avant tout
This concept of, in order to have resistance, you need a strong state with a constitution that represents the social reality, the one from 2004. So just to summarize, if I understood the question, should Afghanistan be a strong state? And I think Ali has a different vision, or with a more decentralized model, or should everything happen in Kabul? When you say that there are 454 districts, you can see that the power is not in Kabul or is not fully covered. Sheikh Kaba, we got 5 extra minutes. Can you conclude, please? And we'll go around the table before we conclude. I don't know, because my projects only cover outside of Kabul. Parman, Panjshir, and each territory has its style, and they often felt left out by the central government. And I think we should need more than 3 minutes to talk about this issue. It's a real debate. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, in July 2001, Commander Massoud asked me to come with a Swiss MP and to bring him the Swiss constitution to study the Swiss federal model. This was just a study. This woman came with me in the Panjshir Valley to meet Commander Massoud and brought the Swiss constitution. At the time, he was a true visionary for the future of Afghanistan, studying different models. So I cannot answer this question, but I did want to answer a question from French people. Yes, the Afghan nation exists. Yes, we feel like Afghan people, and there is an Afghan entity, a country that is much older than France. And when I was 12 years old, in school, in Paris, I learned, because my teacher asked me, what ethnic are you from? And I didn't know, because I am the fruit of a mix of different ethnies in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Afghanistan is a country made up of ethnic minorities. There is no majority in the country. This is the beauty. It's a mosaic of different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different cultures. And this is why our platform, the National Resistance Front, and our constituency and our people, we believe Afghanistan isn't a nation state. It's a multicultural state, and that's the beauty of our society, having that diversity, having political and cultural pluralism, multiculturalism flourish, not nationalism. Nationalism belongs to the 19th and 20th century for us. But in Afghanistan, a country made up of ethnic minorities, we need multiculturalism to create that pluralism in society, and tolerance and acceptance that is needed. This is our platform, and we believe that decentralization, a federated system, is the solution to move forward in order to ensure equality, justice, and freedom for everyone in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Fauzia.
Specifically on what the younger generation and the population at large in your countries could do. As my friend said, too specific, because I think we have a list of demands and it's endless. We don't want to further confuse you with what we want and what should be done, but too specific. One, I mentioned also in the morning, I'm sure as young population you are connected with your politicians, elected officials, members of Senate, your deputies, your local government, etc. Please work with them to keep their attention on Afghanistan, because I know that with the world priorities, the priorities also change, and Afghanistan probably, for many people, it's a safe country. I don't know what's the definition of safety, because if 55% of our population in a country are not part of any progress, how could we claim safety? I'm sure because there is no more explosion, big explosion, as it was before committed by some of these Taliban insurgents, we will not be making the headlines. But I'm expecting that in long run, you should think that if Afghanistan is not safe, your own countries will not be safe. So therefore, we hope that you will continue to pressurize your government to stay engaged with people of Afghanistan. That is very important. Secondly, as you mentioned, I came almost less than a month ago, and I'm going back hopefully soon. There are a lot of young girls who had big dreams about the future. We cannot evacuate 35 million people of Afghanistan to Europe or US. People who are in Afghanistan, they need help, especially those young girls. So if you can financially sponsor one of those girls to go to one of the neighboring countries, especially, for instance, India or Turkey, which is more feasible, for scholarship to continue their education for 4 years. In 4 years' time, they will be able to finish their education, and hopefully the situation on the ground will be better for them to return. So if you want, you said you have contact. My daughters are here, a generation that I put so much hope that they will be the president of their country one day, but I see the situation unfold differently. They can give you my address. Stay in touch with me. We are part of the protest, if not big, small protest every day in the streets of Kabul. We would like to sponsor girls to go to further pursue their education, because I think, Taliban or any other military extremist groups anywhere in the world, they could commit genocide to finish a nation. But the hard thing would be if they stop education for a nation. That society can die in no time. Let's avoid death of our society by educating boys and girls. I'm not pro-tech education, online education, etc., because we need to send the girls to school. Why are we doing things that is in contrary to Islam? In Islam, my religion, it says, Iqra, means read. The faith that I believe starts with reading and writing. Taliban are doing on the contrary to what my belief is. So therefore, we should send girls to school. And this was my message to teachers and students in Afghanistan. I told them, go to school, even if Taliban stop you. And that's what we plan to do. Hopefully, when I go back to Afghanistan, we will go to school. My school age is gone, but I will accompany girls to go to school to study, because we deserve to go to official school. I don't support online. I don't support going to 2001 and before that. So therefore, I think your role here is very important. You have a passion. Thank you. We need you to stay in action with us.
Thank you, Fawzia. We really have to wrap up. So I will give the floor.
I'll just give the floor to Michael Barry very shortly, Liseron, and Cyril, and then we'll conclude. Michael, I know you can be brief. Firstly, on education. Education is key, and there are several of us who are organizing university lessons that will contribute to maintaining a higher level in Afghanistan online and a basis abroad to keep an Afghani culture, an Afghani identity. It is crucial. There's no human rights without women's rights and education rights. Secondly, concerning the debate on nation state, federal state, centralized state, of course, as an American, I can only prefer the federal situation, but I want to say that it is crucial that there are institutions that are perceived throughout the country, throughout Afghanistan, that are seen as a general service. The country is being torn between ethnic disagreements because various governments, including the one that is there, is not providing the population the protection that any population has a right to, and it favors the falling back onto each ethnic. So it is crucial that in all our NGOs, our university that we are maintaining, it is very important that we provide services given to the whole of the Afghani population, that they can refer to that as something that is there, be they Tajik or Hazara or Pashtun. So that's the second point. Thank you, Michael. We can't see you anymore now. And I'll conclude by saying that I totally support a resistance that needs to be international as well as domestic. I know how brave Afghani resistance and Panjshir resistance are. So your network connection is weak, but your voice is very strong. Thank you, Michael. I'll give the floor to Lison and to Cyril. You're a journalist. I know you can be brief. Yes, international resistance, as you said, Michael, is the only aim that one can have today. But there are several ways to resist. Personally, and I'm sorry because I think military resistance today is not the solution. I'm sorry, Adi, because the only way to put pressure on the Talibans, who have defeated the first army in the world, it's ready and negotiated with the American administration. So the world has changed. They haven't changed, maybe, but they need us too. So we need to be able to understand that, and as we heard in the first question, it's not only we are the good ones and they are the bad ones. No, we need to try, and Faiza knows it because she was negotiating. She was trying to talk to them for months and months. We need to keep trying, because if they close Afghanistan down into obscurity, I don't think they will last very long. Cyril. And very briefly, I agree with what Lisa has said. We're not in favor of the Talibans, but we're not politicians. We need to know who we're facing. If there is not a form of inclusivity, of realpolitik with the Talibans, then maybe the Islamic State will take over, and the NGOs who decided to stay after August 31st have understood that. So I'm not saying anything in favor of the Talibans, but we need to be able to see what the forces there are. And beyond forums like this, we just need to remember and keep thinking about Afghanistan. And as journalists, we tend to change topic or news very quickly, very quickly. But no, we need to keep thinking about Afghanis and Afghanistan. Be convinced that within the France-Afghanistan club, we won't forget Afghanistan. That's why this association exists. And I'll give Françoise the final word. I'll invite the audience to leave the room as quickly as possible after Françoise's conclusion. There's no final word because the fight is continuing. I want to thank you and thank all our speakers, and thank you for your questions.